Welcome to another episode of The Case for Messiah. We're actually in the second part of our series, The Messiah, Son of Joseph. I'm here with Dr. Golan Broshi and our very special guest, Dr. David Mitchell, who is, as we mentioned in the first episode, an expert in the whole study of Messiah, Son of Joseph. And I want to begin by telling you, you've got us confused. You know, the New Testament seems to present one Messiah. I've always understood the Hebrew Bible as the promise of one Messiah.
Son of David.
The Son of David. And now you're telling us that the Hebrew Bible promises two Messiahs. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, or perhaps more. We have, of course, very clear in Genesis 49, is the promise to Judah of a ruler, and the promise to Joseph that one from Shaddai will come to become a shepherd rock. And then again, Moses makes it very clear that there's a firstborn ox hero who is coming, promised to Joseph, who will conquer and rule the world. But then later, Moses also says, the Lord will raise up for me, up from among you, a prophet like me from among your brothers. So this led to belief in a Messiah like Moses from the tribe of Levi. And this comes also in Samuel, where the Lord will raise up a righteous priest. So by the time we get to the period after the Bible, we find that many Israelites are believing in four Messiahs. We have this remarkable document called 4Q Testimonia from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it dates from the very early 1st century BC. That's the text. So the actual ideas in the text could be from this early 2nd century. It's certainly well before the time of Jesus. And this is a single page text, and it's got 4 separate paragraphs clearly marked off. And each of its 4 sections is a Bible text ending with a curse. And so it speaks of the prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18, Numbers 24, the star came out of Jacob, which points to the Messiah from David. Deuteronomy 33, the blessing of the Levites, which points to a priest Messiah, and Joshua 6:26, which points to a Joshua Messiah like Messiah ben Yosef. Now, many of the commentators do not recognize the 4th one as a messianic prophecy. They recognize the first 3 as messianic prophecies, but they don't like the 4th one. But the 4th one points to a Joshua Messiah. So we have 4Q Testimonia points to 4 Messiahs.
So Joshua, i.e. a descendant of Joseph.
Of course, Joshua is a descendant of Joseph, and the Messiah ben Yosef is a second Joshua, just like the Messiah ben David is a second David. Now, this idea continues into rabbinic literature. In rabbinic literature, we find a baraita, an early tradition, which speaks of 4 Messiahs.
Exactly.
And this appears many times. I'm aware of it seven times in rabbinic literature. And the 4 Messiahs are Messiah ben David, Messiah ben Yosef, and the prophet and the priest. And sometimes the prophet and the priest merge together and you get 3 Messiahs, and sometimes they're separate. But there's always Messiah ben David, Messiah ben Yosef, and quite often another one as well. So the idea that there was just one Messiah expected is not correct. Some people were expecting several Messiahs.
So it's either several Messiahs or several types of Messiah.
Well, that's a good question.
Exactly.
That's a good question. There's several promises.
Yes.
There's a promise to Joseph, there's a promise to Judah, and then there are hints about a prophet and a priest Messiah from Moses and in the book of Samuel.
Wow.
Interesting.
And also in Zechariah too, where the Kohen Gadol is seen as a prophecy of something to come.
Yeah, the high priest.
Joshua ben Yehozadak.
So we need to get back to Zechariah 12, because actually you're making problems for us.
Well, I wonder if you're in too much of a hurry to get back to Zechariah 12, but go on.
Oh, we don't have to go to Zechariah 12, but we got to come back to that, because if you remember in one of our podcasts, we'd spent a lot of research on Zechariah 12, and we made the case that it's not Messiah, son of Joseph, it's a Messiah, son of David. And so that's going to be something we can talk about. Yeah. But before we share a little bit more maybe about these 4 Messiahs, if there's more that you need to share.
Well, let me just start by saying this. In Deuteronomy and Genesis, we clearly have a Messiah promised to Joseph. And in the same places we have a Messiah promised to Judah, they are separate. Can they become one? And what we find is that by the time of Zechariah, Zechariah wants to make them one.
That's interesting.
And he's not the only one. I think Jeremiah is doing the same thing. And the question we have to ask, are we expecting 4 Messiahs? Or are we expecting 2? Or are we expecting 1? And clearly we can see from John's Gospel that people in the time of Jesus really didn't know. They said, who doesn't Elijah have to come first? And if the Messiah comes, where is he to come from? Doesn't the Messiah come from David's tribe and all the rest of it? What we are dealing with here is messianic types.
Exactly.
In theory, they could be fulfilled in different people, but I think ultimately in the Bible points us to them being fulfilled in one person.
But you've kind of jumped to the New Testament, and you're saying you're begging the question. You're saying, okay, we know the New Testament, it's one Messiah, one person, it's all merged. Is there any evidence in the Hebrew Bible, though, that some people actually, prophets, actually started to see these 4 types of Messiah being merged into a single figure?
Yeah, I think there is. I think the place where this really happens is in Zechariah. Perhaps Zechariah picked up some hints from Jeremiah, because Jeremiah likes to portray Josiah, who was a Davidic king, in Josephite imagery. But it really begins to come together in Zechariah. Zechariah is aware of 2 messianic traditions. He knows that a Messiah who must die is promised to Joseph, and a Messiah who will rule is promised to Judah and David. And what we find is that in Zechariah chapters 9 to 14, he tells us about a coming shepherd king who seems to be both Messiah ben David and Messiah ben Yosef. He's like Solomon. He will rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. That's
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. And also in chapter 9, he will redeem Joseph's children from the dry pit. He will redeem the sons of Joseph from the dry pit. Like Joseph was in a dry pit, so Joseph's children in exile, and he will redeem them. But like David, he will be a shepherd. But like Joseph, he will be sold for pieces of silver. He will be rejected and stricken and pierced through, just like Jacob says Joseph was pierced through in Genesis 49. And he will be bitterly mourned like who? Like the mourning for Josiah, who was from David's line. And then in the end, he will rule the whole world like Solomon.
Interesting. Joseph was mourned, right, by his father.
Of
So
course,
you've got
of course.
perhaps double imagery here.
Yeah, we have. So the stricken shepherd, Zechariah has 2 messianic types which he is fusing together. One like Solomon, the other like Joseph. The stricken shepherd comes on both sides of the pierced king, and the victorious Solomon king comes on both sides of the smitten, pierced shepherd. And it looks like all these figures enclosed inside one another, like babushka dolls, are really one and the same figure.
Yeah.
They're displaying mixed up characteristics of the promised world rulers from Judah and from Joseph. Like a second Solomon, he will rule from sea to sea. Like a second Joseph, he is betrayed and pierced, sold for silver, and mourned like a slain firstborn. And then he will become the ruler of all the nations. So Zechariah himself is fusing together the imagery of the Messiah from the tribe of Joseph and the Messiah from the tribe of David.
Yeah, so in other words, it's not either or. He's either the Messiah son of David or the Messiah son of Joseph. He could be both.
He could be both. How can he be both? How can he be both? How can one person descend from 2 separate patriarchs? Well, there is one way, but it's not through the patrilineal line. It has to be through the matrilineal line.
Oh.
Patrilineal as in through the father,
Through the father's line.
matrilineal
You
through the
cannot
mother.
descend from 2 separate fathers, but through the fathers, you can descend. The patrilineal lines can meet in one mother. And this is what we believe about Jesus. We believe that he was incarnated, and Yeshua was incarnated in the womb of Maryam the Virgin, by the Holy Spirit. And she was a descendant of Joseph and of David and of Aaron and yet from his father's side, he didn't descend from any.
So
of
wait.
the patriarchs.
You're saying Mary was a descendant. She was a descendant of David. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
You're saying she was a descendant of Aaron, and we have that clue from Luke because she's a relative of Elizabeth.
Yeah, and there's a lot more, but yes, we have
But you're
that.
saying that Mary is a relative of Joseph,
Well, exactly.
descendant
because
of Joseph.
you see, Omri was king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and it's almost certain he was a descendant of Joseph. It is not said in the text. We don't know who his father was. But if Omri were not a descendant of Joseph, the Ephraimites would never have accepted him as king. All the rulers of the northern kingdom had to come from Joseph. So otherwise he wouldn't have been accepted. So Omri from the house of Joseph begat Ahab, and Ahab begat Athaliah, who married Jehoram of the house of David. And then through their son, Ahaziah, the seed of Joseph enters the lineage of David. And so the lineage of David has the blood both of Joseph and of David.
So, I mean, this is, again, we've always thought of Jesus as the son of David. I mean, that just seems to be like the default.
Yeah.
But we've never actually considered that the genealogies actually show that Jesus is also...
He certainly has Joseph's DNA.
He's got Joseph's DNA. He's got Aaron's DNA. In other words, it is quite possible physically for one individual to bring together all four messianic types.
Exactly.
Genetically, it's possible.
Genetically, it's possible through the matrilineal line.
Yeah, and he's called son of Joseph in the New Testament.
Of course.
So typically in the rabbinic perspective, there's a distinction between, David, the Messiah, son of David, he rules and reigns. The Messiah, son of Joseph, he suffers and dies. But biblically speaking, and in terms of the narratives, it's really interesting that Joseph not only suffers, he's described as reigning glorious. David, who reigns, suffers terribly. And if you read the book of Psalms, I mean, other than Job, I don't know, in the Hebrew Bible, who suffered more. David is just lamenting, okay? And so to try to distinguish, David only reigns and Joseph only suffers is an artificial distinction, number one. But number two, it seems like their story arcs, they totally overlap. And so again, the fact that in both cases, a father sends the younger son out to check on his older brothers, that he's mocked. And if you look at the ways in which the story arc is combined, it's hard to separate the two. And it's quite clear that the biblical authors did not want to make such a strong distinction between David, who only reigns, and Joseph, who only suffers. Both of their lives interlap in such a way that it's as if we're dealing with, in that sense, the possibility of one person who carries all these roles in himself.
Amen.
Yeah, I think that's true. Huh? I just wonder if we can talk about the sufferings of Joseph and of David. Why does Joseph become the symbol of suffering? And I think his sufferings are greater. Remember, David suffers, but everybody still knows where he is. David suffers, but he still has a band of followers. Mm-hmm. David suffers, but Joseph is gone. Joseph is
considered dead.
He's considered dead. His father is weeping for him, and he's buried in a dungeon under the ground in one way or another for 11 years, isn't it? The rabbis tell us. So I think the rejection of Joseph is that much greater. And the kingship of David's a little different because David is a sovereign king and Joseph is the vizier. He's second in charge to the king of the world. We can see this. There are slight differences. I agree with what you're saying. I just think there's one or two little nuances we could consider a little bit more. Why does Joseph become the symbol of the suffering Messiah and David the conquering Messiah? Yes, they both suffer and they both triumph. But I think Joseph's sufferings, in a sense, are more severe than David's. Joseph enters into this near-death existence. He is thrown into a pit and he is sold as a slave and he ends up in a dungeon, and for one way or another, he's there for 11 years. And he seems to spend these years of his life underground in a buried death-like state. David does not. Yes, David's in a cave, but he's got his followers. He's even got his wives with him. But Joseph's exile from the land of his Israel and from his people is complete. It is severe. It is prolonged. David gets a little exile in Gath, but he remains in touch with everybody back home. Joseph is completely gone. No one knows where he is. No one can contact him. Everyone, including his father, thinks he's dead. His father is weeping for him. So I think, yes, Joseph's sufferings seem to be greater than David's, but they both suffer and they both conquer.
So I want to kind of double around here because, again, David, I remember reading your book on the Psalms years ago, and it changed my understanding of the Psalms. I mean, you've had a big influence on me personally, and I'm grateful. You're introducing to me ways to think now, and to us and to our viewers, that we've never actually considered, okay? But I want to double around and talk again. You're saying that, and Golan, you hit this, that Zechariah chapter 12, in one of our podcasts, we gave very strong support that this is a Davidic Messiah, and there is overwhelming support. All the references to David in the book of Zechariah fall right in chapters 12 and 13. The house of David is mourning specifically. Why would they be mourning specifically? But for the fact that one of their own was killed, right? Or, died, okay? We looked at chapter 9 of Zechariah where, this one who is, it says, endowed with salvation and humble in some of the English translations, but in our earlier podcast, we argued he is rescued and he is afflicted. So you've already got this anticipation of a suffering Davidic Messiah. But because of the additional information you're giving, you're actually arguing that Zechariah is intentionally combining both the imagery of Messiah, son of Joseph, and he's combining Messiah, son of Joseph, with Messiah, son of David, in a single figure. That's what you're saying.
That's correct. And the interesting thing about this isn't my opinion. One of the commonest texts, after Deuteronomy 33:17, the commonest text the rabbis cite about Messiah ben Yosef is Zechariah 12:10.
Exactly.
So we find this in the Targum Tosefta to Zechariah. We find this in the Talmud, Sukkah 52a. We find it throughout the Rishonim. We find it in Rashi. We find it in Ibn Ezra. And in many, many other places. I don't have them on the top of my head. This is Zechariah 12:10, the king who is pierced through, is a text the rabbis always refer to Messiah ben Yosef. Why is this? Because he's sold for pieces of silver and he is pierced through and he dies.
It's amazing. And let me just kind of, I think, elaborate a little bit here too. At least within Jewish thinking, there's an insistence that there's a distinction in persons between the Messiah, son of Joseph, and the Messiah, son of David. Like there's an insistence. But what's interesting, we mentioned it in the first podcast, that actually in the Hebrew Bible, Joseph and David come together textually. So
they are very similar in some ways.
So in the research that, I've done a lot of research in what's called narrative analogies, where one story, one narrative is written intentionally to parallel another narrative. And what's remarkable is that the story of David, the person who tells the story of David's rise to power, he tells the story of David's rise to power as an analogy to Joseph's rise to power. And so being sent out to the father, being despised by the brother. There's a phrase that it talks about David being very good looking, right? And also wise, navon. And those two come together, right? Only of Joseph. And
similar text, right? Similar language.
Well, so Saul is looking for somebody to come into his court. So you have David, who's navon, he's wise. The Pharaoh is looking for somebody to solve his dreams. So he comes and he gets Joseph, who is wise, okay? And so it is clear that the author of the David story, the David account, he is wanting us to see David as a second Joseph. Now, he obviously is not like Joseph in every way because he falls. He doesn't pass the test of being tempted with adultery, right? And so punishment comes to David's house. we mentioned earlier in the first podcast, but it's really important to mention this. There's a Hebrew article by the scholar Dr. Michael Avioz, and he basically shows that the description of Jehoiachin's release from prison in the 37th year of the exile, after Israel's exile. So this story appears in 2 Kings, but also in Jeremiah 52. And if you look at the way that Jehoiachin's release is described, where he's in prison, he's taken out, his clothes are changed, he's sat on a throne, he's given a meal. Well, the language there and the plot structure, the parallels almost certainly connect the release of this Davidic king to the story of Joseph. The author wants us to see somehow the hope in the house of David also connected with the hope in the house of Joseph.
In light of Joseph, yeah.
And this is consistent with what the scriptures teach. And so you've basically, for us, you've actually helped us understand that it's not either or in Zechariah chapter 12.
Oh no, Zechariah is combining the two messianic promises in one figure.
It's pretty amazing.
No.
Now, are there any other passages that you see? You'd mentioned Jeremiah. Are there other passages where you see this idea combined?
Yeah, you said something about the Psalms yesterday with Yehoseph.
Yeah.
Well, in the Psalms begin with David, and they end with David, but in the middle it's all about Joseph. And we find in Psalm 81 that there's a reference to a figure called Yehoseph. Now, how can we possibly explain this word Yehoseph?
Yeah, now in the Hebrew it's clear that it's half Judah, half Joseph.
That's
it's
right.
Yehoseph. It's who is this guy?
Yehoseph.
Yeah.
I mean, we've perhaps got three names mixed up together. For a start, there's Yehuda, and then there's Joseph, Yosef, and perhaps there is the name of God, Yehovah. And the three names have been portmanteaued into one word. So we have a Joseph, Judah, Messiah who comes from Shaddai, just like the promise in Genesis 49, 24, because from there will come the shepherd rock from Shaddai.
So going back to Psalms, because again, my discovery of thinking about the book of Psalms as an actual book with intelligent design, not just the individual Psalms, it actually, part of the influence came from you, and then my professor of Psalms, Dr. Robert Cole, who's published extensively. And so we've also done another podcast on the structure of Psalms. And basically what's interesting is that if you actually look at Psalms as a book, Psalms 1 and 2 have been considered by scholars as actually the introduction to the whole of the book. It's the message of the book of Psalms.
The pillars at the doorway of the book of Psalms.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you, in sharing a little bit about Psalm 1 and 2, and by the way, the rabbis, the ancient rabbinic commentators actually argue that Psalm 1 and 2 are one. Are one because of all the language that joins them together.
Yeah,
It should be read as one.
Right.
But you said something interesting. You said that you argue that in Psalm 1 is the presentation of a Joseph-like Messiah.
A Joseph and a Joshua-like Messiah.
And then in chapter 2 of Psalms, a Davidic Messiah. So
that's right.
could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the Messiah in Psalm 1 is like Joshua. He has to meditate on the Torah day and night. And this is what Joshua was told to do. He must meditate in Torah night and day.
That's Joshua chapter 1.
That's Joshua chapter 1. But he's also like Joseph because he is like a tree planted by streams of water. Now, if we go back to Genesis 49, Joseph is the plant that springs up from dry ground and its branches go over the wall. So the tree planted by streams of water is a picture of Joseph. And so we have in Psalm 1 a Joseph and a Joshua Messiah. But as soon as we turn to Psalm 2, we have a Messiah who sits on Mount Zion. So he's a Messiah from David's line. And we have to understand that these two Psalms together tell the story of the book of Psalms from the beginning to the end. He is the Messiah, is the wise man who meditates on Torah. He will prosper in his time, even against much opposition, because his roots are beside the streams of water, and in the end he will rule and conquer his enemies from Mount Zion. They are the one Messiah, but in Psalm 1 he's painted as Joseph, and Joshua, and in Psalm 2 he's painted as
Yeah,
David.
he starts as Joseph and he finishes as David.
Exactly.
So that actually then makes sense of what you found in your research, that the bookends of the book of Psalms, David is emphasized, and in the middle of the book of Psalms, Joseph.
is emphasized. And we read again about his sufferings in Egypt and all the rest of it.
So maybe we can summarize this, what we've said in this episode, just kind of to help our viewers. Basically, the question came up, you introduced to us something that, we hadn't much thought about, and that is that there's not just one Messiah promised in the Hebrew Bible. There are four
Types.
of Messiah.
Four types.
Right? And we hadn't ever considered that before. And you talked about a prophetic type Messiah. You talked about an Aaronic type Messiah. You've talked about a Messiah son of Joseph and a Messiah son of David. And what we've said is that, you could conclude that there are four different Messiahs, but biblically we actually start to see
The biblical writers themselves, especially Zechariah, want to combine the two main Messiahs, Messiah ben Yosef and Messiah ben David. Zechariah wants to combine them. And in a sense, well, if we're talking about Yeshua, the New Testament tells us, the book of Hebrews tells us, he is also the priest Messiah. And the prophet, well, Yeshua was a prophet, but then, of course, Malachi tells us that the prophet Elijah will come before the great day of the Lord, and Jesus identifies him with
John.
with John Baptist. So it's complicated, and we are talking in a sense. We have even two figures in the New Testament. We have a prophet, John the Baptist, and then we have Jesus, who fulfills the role of king and sacrifice and priest. And prophet.
So this is actually a really good segue for our next episode, because you've left us kind of in suspense. Because again, I've always assumed, I got to be honest with you, I've always assumed that the New Testament simply presents Jesus as the Messiah son of David, that there's no other, that's the only presentation. And so in the next episode, we're going to actually look, and you're going to actually argue that the New Testament actually intends to present Jesus not only as the Messiah son of David, but as the Messiah son of Joseph.
That's right. I can't wait.
Amen.
If this touched your heart, will you help pay it forward to reach others who need to hear this message? Partner with our team to bring the gospel to Israel and the nations.